Okay, so let's get right into it. Picture this. You're fighting for your job. You feel like you were fired unfairly, and you decide to sue. Simple enough, right? But what if your boss isn't just some company? What if your boss is the United Nations? All of a sudden, your fight for justice hits a brick wall, one that's bigger and more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
And that brings us to the massive question at the heart of this whole story. What happens when the rights your own country guarantees you in its constitution go head-to-head with the legal shields of a global organization?
So our story kicks off back in 1991. A group of Filipino workers, led by a man named Lasco, were let go from a UN-backed project exploring for minerals. Now, they believed their dismissal was completely illegal, so they did what any of us would do. They filed a complaint. But after getting shut down by the lower labor courts, their case climbed all the way up to the highest court in the land, the Philippine Supreme Court.
All right, so let's start with the people at the center of all this. For the workers, this was about one thing and one thing only: fighting for their jobs. It seemed like a pretty straightforward battle.
Their argument was really simple and really powerful. They were basically saying, hey, we're Filipino citizens working on Philippine soil. Our rights have been violated. They were putting all their faith in their own constitution, which promises full protection for workers, and they expected the law of their country to back them up.
But, and this is a huge but, the UN was playing a completely different game. They weren't just any old employer. They came to the table armed with an incredibly powerful legal defense, which you could call an immunity shield.
And that shield is called diplomatic immunity. So what is it? Well, it's a fundamental rule of international law that says certain global organizations and their people are protected from being sued or prosecuted in the country they're operating in. You can almost think of it as a legal protective bubble that lets them do their work without local interference.
And we're not talking about some vague, unwritten rule here. No, this is written down, black and white, in a convention that the Philippines had actually signed. The UN agency pointed right to this text, and the key words, the words that would define their entire defense, are immunity from every form of legal process unless it's been expressly waived.
So you're probably asking, why on earth does this kind of powerful shield even exist? Well, the idea behind it is pretty important. It's to make sure that organizations like the UN can do their global missions, whether it's humanitarian aid or scientific research, without getting tangled up in or controlled by the local politics of the host country. It's all about guaranteeing their independence so they can operate freely and impartially.
And that sets up the ultimate showdown. On one side, you've got the constitutional rights of individual citizens, and on the other, you have the legal obligations of a nation to an international treaty it signed.
You could just see the clash of ideas right here. The workers argued, look, this was a commercial mining operation, not some high-level diplomatic mission. They even said that by hiring them, the UN had implied it was giving up its immunity. But the UN fired back, saying, nope, not how it works. We are a special fund of the UN, and our immunity has to be expressly waived in writing, which we never did. So it became a direct fight, the Philippine Constitution versus an international treaty.
So you've got these two massive legal principles just crashing into each other. How in the world did the Supreme Court figure this one out? Well, this is where the case takes a really fascinating turn.
You'd think the decision would come down to labor law or the nature of the project, but nope. The entire case ended up hinging on one single decisive piece of paper, a letter from the Philippines' own Department of Foreign Affairs.
And this letter triggered something called the political question doctrine. Here's how it worked, in 3 steps. First, the DFA, which is part of the executive branch of government, officially confirmed that yes, this UN agency had diplomatic immunity. Second, the moment they did that, this case stopped being a simple legal question for a judge and turned into a political question about foreign relations. And third, because of the separation of powers in government, the courts, the judicial branch, had to step back and defer to the executive branch on that kind of political decision.
And what's really important to get here is that the Supreme Court wasn't just inventing a new rule. They were following a principle that had been around for a while. As this quote from a previous case shows, the court's stance was basically, once the government's foreign policy arm makes a call on someone's diplomatic status, it's the job of the courts to respect that call, period.
And that was that. The final verdict was swift and absolute. The petition was dismissed. The Supreme Court essentially said our hands are tied. Because of diplomatic immunity, we don't even have the power, the jurisdiction, to hear this case.
So you might be thinking, wait, that's it? The workers just lose and there's nothing they can do? Well, not quite. The court itself actually pointed them down a different path.
This is a really crucial point. The court's decision wasn't a total dead end. They made it clear that immunity doesn't mean you're denied justice entirely. It just means you have to seek it in a different place.
It turns out that the very same international convention that gives the UN its immunity also requires it to have its own internal systems for settling private disputes, just like employment contracts. So while the door to the Philippine courts was slammed shut, another one, a door inside the UN system itself, was supposed to be open.
Which leaves us right back where we began, with this fundamental unresolved tension. When a country signs an international treaty, it agrees to play by a global set of rules. But what happens when those rules prevent it from protecting its own citizens under its own laws? This case happened decades ago, but the question it forces us to ask is more relevant now than ever. When the rights of an individual citizen clash with the power of a global institution, who should get the final say?